Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today's presentation is being hosted by Transition Matters, a program of the Family Support Center of New Jersey, and presented by Catherine McLaughlin. Before we begin, let's take a minute to go over how we can participate during today's web event. You each have your own control panel in the upper right corner of the screen that looks similar to the one here. Use the orange arrow to open or hide the control panel. To listen to the webinar, you have two audio options to choose from: mic and speakers and telephone. If you can't hear well using your computer speakers, you can elect to use the telephone to listen to the webinar. In order to maintain the best sound quality possible, all but the presenter will be muted throughout the webinar. If you have questions or comments, you can submit them using the questions panel. We will try to get to all questions at the end of the webinar as long as time allows. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenter, Catherine McLaughlin. Catherine is an expert on sexuality and developmental disabilities and has taught sexuality education to people with developmental disabilities, as well as trained them to be peer sexuality educators themselves. She has trained nationally at conferences and workshops. Catherine has developed and led parent workshops on talking to your children with disabilities about sexuality, and has trained staff on how to address sexuality with people who have disabilities. Catherine has co-authored Sexuality Education for Adults with Developmental Disabilities, and she currently leads workshops as a private consultant and also teaches human sexuality at Keene State College in New Hampshire. At this time, I would like to welcome Catherine. So Catherine, I'm going to give you control of the screen.
Okay. All right, shall I begin?
Please, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Melanie, for inviting me to be part of this webinar. As Melanie said, I've been working in this field for over 20 years, talking about sexuality and specifically working with people with developmental disabilities, parents, and staff. And one thing that I know from my work is that it's really difficult for all of us to talk about this topic. It's not something that any of us feel really that comfortable with, some of us more than others. And so really my work has been around helping people just get more comfortable talking about this topic or communicating about this topic. And this webinar is designed for parents and also for staff who work with people with developmental disabilities. So I'll be referring to both populations throughout because there's specific messages I want to give to each of you as well. So welcome to the webinar. And how I wanted to start was to tell you that some of the work I've done has been with self-advocates, and in particular Green Mountain self-advocates. And what I did was I asked people with disabilities why they think that they need sexuality education. Why is it important to them? And these are the responses that they came up with. So we can learn to have healthy relationships, so we aren't lonely, so we're able to make informed choices, so we can pick the right person, for help with the toughest part of the relationship, making it last, so we can be safe, because we all have desires and needs, and that's okay. And I just want to try to get this. Okay. Oops. All right, sorry about that. To get correct information, to get resources and tools to make healthy sexual choices so that people know their rights, so people with disabilities don't put themselves in bad situations. So we will know how to protect ourselves, so we can feel good about ourselves and our bodies, so we can be sexual self-advocates and not just self-advocates. And the Green Mountain self-advocates often talk about how when they say to a parent or a staff person, I'd like to get a job, or I'd like to try to live on my own, or some some aspect of life that we all participate in, they tend to get a really positive response, and people say, oh, okay, well, let's think about what you want to do, or where you might want to live, or what you would need to do that. But when they talk about relationships or sexuality, they get less enthusiasm. And so they talk about this idea of being a sexual self-advocate. And a piece of that is speaking up for what you believe and what you want as far as relationships go. So they describe it as speaking up for yourself sexually, getting information, taking a stand, saying to whomever, this is my choice, stating your sexual limits with your partner and respecting others' limits, starting to do what you want with relationships. So part of my work has been helping people become sexual self-advocates, being able to speak up, get information, take a stand. But speak up that they want a relationship or to be in a relationship, but also to speak up within a relationship so that they have a voice around this topic. So my hope for the next hour is that you'll be able, at the end of this, you'll be able to talk about what makes it difficult for parents and agency staff to talk about sexuality with consumers or people with disabilities. And we'll also look at some solutions to these barriers. And we're going to list topics and when to talk about them. And because a lot of people, that's one of the issues, they're not sure what to talk about when. And discuss ways to teach this topic to youth with developmental disabilities. And in particular, how to answer questions. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk about messages that we get and give, barriers to talking about the topic, human sexual development, what to teach and when, and I'll probably take a break right around there to see if there's any questions halfway through the webinar, just in case something you need some clarification or a question specific to the first part of the webinar. So we'll have a little question and answer possibly, and then we'll move on to more of the tips and tools. So here are some tips for discussing or communicating, different types of questions and how you respond to those, teachable moments, Scarborough method, and how to respond to values, opinions, and personal questions. I'll also give you some information about trainings that I do and the curriculum that I wrote, and then we'll have some time to answer questions at the end as well. So when I say the word sexuality, oftentimes people immediately go to the word sex, but really it means more than sex or intercourse. I mean, that's an aspect of it, but that's not all of it. So when I'm talking with your kids about sexuality, it's more than sex. It's about intimacy and connection and belonging. It's about relationships, how to be a friend, how to start a sexual or romantic relationship. It's also about how we feel about being the gender that we are, how we feel about others and ourselves, how we feel about our bodies. So it's more than sexual expression, but that is a piece, sexual expression and behavior. But it's the total of who we are, what we believe, what we feel, and how we respond. So when I say sexuality, I'm talking about the broader definition. And you know, some of those topics are easier to talk about than others within that broad definition. So when we think about the term sexuality, I want you to think for just a minute, and I'll stop for a few seconds to give you some time to think. But while you were growing up, what was the primary message that you got from your parents about sexuality? Now, these messages could be verbal messages, or they could just be nonverbal messages. But just think for a minute about sort of the message you got about this topic in particular. And what I found is that many people have gotten all kinds of messages, and here are just some examples of some of them. One message people get is, don't do it until you're married, or good girls don't, or it's okay if you're a male to be a sexual being, but not a female. Don't get a girl pregnant or get pregnant. You're on your own with this topic. I'm not going to talk about it. Here's a book, and you can ask me questions. Be safe. It's not okay to talk about this because it's private, it's shameful, and it's embarrassing. So these are sort of primary messages that people get about sexuality and just having any kind of questions about this topic. These are the sort of messages that we get. So what I'm suggesting is that sometimes the messages we get make it really difficult for us to give positive messages because we're so used to this negative message that we get throughout our culture about sexuality. There are other cultures that give more positive messages than we do in this culture. So in general, most people didn't receive any positive messages about this topic growing up. It was all very much about fear and don't do it and stay away. But I think what sometimes happens is people get messages like it's a healthy and normal part of life. This topic can bring you lots of happiness and pleasure. This topic's okay to talk about and have questions about. So a real openness. So that's what I'm suggesting as sort of the first tip around talking about this, whether you're a parent or a staff person, is to give positive messages, that this is an okay topic to talk about. It's a normal and healthy part of life. So that's sort of my first suggestion. Since many of us didn't get that, that's easier said than done. But when we think about youth with developmental disabilities, we go even further as far as the messages that they get. So think for a minute about what messages do you think youth with developmental disabilities get, and how they might be different than the ones we get. And oftentimes, people will say that the messages that people with developmental disabilities get are even stronger. Like, you are not a sexual being. You should not have sex. You are innocent and childlike, and you need protection from sexuality. You are not responsible. You cannot solve problems. You're unable to make good decisions about sexuality. You always make mistakes. You would not be a good parent, so you should not have children. And you're different than your non-disabled siblings. So as you can see, they're a little stronger than, say, the general population might get about sexuality, but also very negative. So my suggestion is, as I said before, is to give positive messages, to keep the conversation going, and to respond to this topic rather than react. So we're going to give positive messages, and I'll tell you about a place where you will put that in as well, positive messages. Okay, so moving right along here. Another thing that I often talk to people about are what are the barriers, or what gets in the way of being able to discuss this topic with those you're working with or your own children? Like, what makes it difficult? And as I mentioned, oftentimes the messages we received were negative, so we're not used to having these conversations or thinking of it in sort of a positive way. But also, we don't know what to cover and when and how much is too much. So sort of what do we cover when, and does it matter based on the cognitive versus the biological age? So that's something we'll talk about today. Another barrier is people are really worried that it gives permission, that if you talk about it, you're saying, go for it. And that's not the case at all. The other reason people say it's really difficult is that there are no role models. I've had parents say to me, can you just say, just answer the question so I can hear what just a healthy and normal conversation about sexuality sounds like? Because I've never heard it before. So we don't have any role models. We don't really know how to do this. We either don't talk about it in our culture or we joke about it, right? So those are really our only choices. And joking about it's fun, and that's good. But there's also, how can you just have a normal conversation about it? Another barrier might be a staff person and parents. They might have different values about what's okay as far as relationships go, and that can be a barrier when you're working with parents and staff and a person with a disability, having different values. Another barrier, people say, is it's just an awkward conversation. It's embarrassing, so it's just uncomfortable. And then just referring to staff, one of the issues that they worry about is that they're going to lose their job. You know, is it okay to talk about this? I don't really know if it's my role to do that, and whether I should do that, or whether I'll lose my job. And even just not really knowing how as a staff person or a parent is a barrier. So I'm going to try to address some of these barriers throughout the next hour. So the first thing that I want to start out with is doing kind of a brief overview of human sexual development. So with human sexual development, really the beginning is the development of biological sex. So what this means is when a baby's born, what we do is we look at their biological sex, and we decide, in our culture, we decide whether the person is male or female, even though it isn't always that clear for people. But we look at the external genitals and we say, it's a boy or it's a girl. And then we assign a gender. So the next piece of human sexual development is gender assignment. So we assign the gender, and then there's the development of gender identity. Now this is something that happens around age 2 or 3, when a young person starts to identify as either male or female. So they might say, I'm a boy, and, you know, I'm a girl, and around 3 or 4 they realize that that's not going to change. When they're younger, they think maybe they'll change to a girl the next day, but very young, people develop their gender identity, and it's a psychological, innate sense of your gender. So that happens, and then we also, once we identify and have been assigned a gender, we learn how to act that gender, right? People even describe it as putting on the gender outfit, which means for females, we're supposed to, wear pink and be sweet and kind all the time, and for boys, we're supposed to wear blue, and we're supposed to be strong and unemotional, or whatever. So we learn how we're supposed to do gender in our culture, and that varies by culture. So different cultures have different ways of doing gender. Biological sex is the same across culture. So we know that that's biology because it's the same, where societal gender roles change, meaning that they could be different depending on where you are. And that means that you could change them in your culture. So that's the beginning, and then there's the development of values and attitudes about sexuality. So early on, young people learn about values and attitudes regarding this topic. So it's not that people learn values later on in life. They tend to have them early on. They might change later in life, but in general, you acquire them very young, even before puberty. Then there are the physical and emotional changes of puberty, which when we're talking to youth, it's a big issue for them. And so we're going to start talking about the physical as well as emotional changes of puberty. And another piece of human sexual development is the development of one's sexual orientation. So this is actually broken down into 3 components. There's your affectional attraction, so who you like, your romantic attraction, who you love, and your erotic attraction, which is who you lust after. So they're all different sort of aspects of orientation. And so your sexual orientation develops during puberty because part of the puberty changes are that your hormones are starting, and you are going to, your body's going to start changing, and that's sort of this idea about the development of sexual orientation. If you ask someone who is gay or lesbian growing up, did they know they were a young gay person, they would say, no, I didn't know until I went through puberty, but I always felt a little bit different, but they wouldn't necessarily know what that meant. So really the development of sexual orientation, the feelings that you have develop during puberty. Then there's the development of sexual behavior where you express yourself in a certain way. so it's the behavior. And then there's the development of your sexual identity. So you identify as either heterosexual or homosexual, bisexual, and there's many different kinds of identities people identify as. But that's something that you do yourself. It's your own sexual identity. But these three are connected, and oftentimes they line up, meaning your orientation is heterosexual and you develop and behave that way and identify that way. But sometimes, because our culture is very focused on being heterosexual, we oftentimes, sometimes people may not accept those feelings and act on those feelings because of our culture. But those three are very much connected. And then after puberty and throughout puberty and beyond is the development of sexual knowledge and skills. So people learn more about sexuality and they learn more sexual skills as they get older and throughout life. So that was like a broad overview of human sexual development. But what I wanted to tell you are there's sort of specific topics that are of interest or concern or certain behaviors that happen at young ages. And the reason I tell you this is so that you know what is sort of typical sexual development, but also so that you can sort of use this as a checklist. You know, if my son or daughter is 12, do they know, and then look at this list and say, do they know the different body parts and their names and their functions? Do they know that genital touching is okay as long as it's done in private? You know, sort of using this as a checklist. So this is young children. They often have questions about body parts and functions. What's that? What do you call it? My suggestion is that you use the correct terminology for sexual parts for a lot of different reasons. But one is it sends a positive message that this body part is like any body part. It's part of your body, and we need to take care of it. But also, it gives young people language that protects them in a way. So you don't seem as vulnerable when you have the correct terms. So if, you know, we know that people with disabilities have a higher risk of sexual abuse, having the language gives you more power. And so my belief is that if someone says, don't touch my penis, they seem to be less vulnerable and then less able to be victimized. So it gives them power, as well as just normalizes the body part. Another thing that happens to young children is that it's very natural and normal for them to touch their genitals when their diapers are being changed, when they're sitting in the car. It's just a very soothing thing. It's not a highly sexual thing. And so it's very normal for that to happen, and we can give messages about that being normal, but something that people need to do in private. The other thing is sex play. So young children will engage in sex play, and it is curiosity-based. It is not sexual or erotic-based. That happens after you go through puberty, where you have the hormones that will give you that erotic sense. This is much more of show me yours, I'm curious, ooh, interesting. So it's coming from that perspective. So I tell you that because many times people react because it looks sexual. So if you have a 5-year-old looking at someone's genitals, we react rather than just respond and say, you know, we're going to keep our clothes on when we play together, and so I need you to get dressed, or something really calm and responsive versus reactive. So it's just curiosity. And then young children, and some of you may have had this experience with your own children, they want to know about how they were born. How did they get in there? The first question is usually, how did they get out? And then the second question is, how did they get in? And so being, especially for parents, as honest as possible, it creates an opportunity for young people to know that you're there for them if they have any questions about this, and know that you're going to be honest. So this is an opportunity to really set that in motion in your relationship with your child. Then we also learn about the roles of male and female that I referred to earlier. There's also body image and learning about our bodies. And there's also an increase need for privacy. And this is something that often has to be taught to people with developmental disabilities about privacy. And we'll talk more about that later. But that's the young children, what's going on for young children regarding sexual development. And then we move into adolescence, and many, many topics here. So changes of puberty, hygiene, friendships, reproduction, pregnancy, birth, pregnancy options, sexual expression, sexual feelings, masturbation, contraception, and sexually transmitted infections. So the list goes on, not to overwhelm anybody here. And sexual orientation, gender identity, body image, establishing and maintaining intimate relationships, and breaking up. So there's all kinds of topics to be talked about. And what I always tell parents as well as staff is we need to focus on the biological age of the young person. So if we have a youth who's 13, they need to know about all the topics that adolescents need to know about. And the only difference with someone with a disability is how you teach it, not what you teach. So you want to base it on the biological age. Sometimes people will say, well, but yes, they're 13, but they have a cognitive age of 6. It doesn't matter. What matters is the biological age. How you teach it's going to be different, not what. So that's why I give you this list, too, is to see what are the topics that adolescents need to know about, or youth. And then you're going to have to work on how, which is a different way of teaching it. There's also interests and concerns of adults as well. So this doesn't end after adolescence. There's lots of things we need to learn about as we get older, as adults, just as, menopause, just as we have to learn about puberty. And I know we're just talking about youth today, so I won't go into too much of that. But just to know that, we are learning about sexuality from when we're very young to very old. So it's something that's changing throughout our lives. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the, so what's the same regarding human sexual development for people with disabilities versus people without disabilities, and then what's different? So I just have a brief list here. What's the same is that we are assigned a gender. We all get assigned a gender. Our gender roles are reinforced, so we really teach young people about how to be male and how to be female, and we reinforce those. Their biological changes are very similar as far as when puberty begins, when someone develops. They need the same information based on the biological age, so that's the same as well, and I mentioned that before. They have sexual feelings and needs just like anyone else, and they have dreams like anyone else might, to be in a relationship, to maybe have a baby. So all of that is the same. What seems to be different is that people don't discuss the topic. So they think, I've had many people with disabilities say that their parents address the topic very differently with their child without a disability than they did with them. So they often don't talk about it. Or they think that they're oversexed, meaning that if someone with a disability might be doing a typical normal behavior but happens to do it in the wrong place, we have a strong reaction to it. So we have this idea that they're doing it in this wrong place because they're just oversexed rather than just don't have any privacy. What's different is there's a much higher rate of sexual abuse done to children and adults with developmental disabilities. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. We're also very forgiving and accept certain behaviors, though. So if someone with a disability hugs a stranger, the stranger says, oh, it's okay, it doesn't matter. But if a 17-year-old without a disability did that, they would have a very strong reaction to it. So we sort of think about it as you're childlike. It's okay, you didn't mean anything kind of thing. So we get those different messages. Many people with disabilities lack friendships, and many people without disabilities had these social opportunities to hang out with friends and learn about relationships, and that's something that many people with disabilities have not had the opportunity to do. And many many people would say that's how they learned a lot about it. You know, the parents didn't necessarily talk to them, but friends talked to them. Whether it was accurate or not, some of it must have been, hopefully. People with disabilities don't pick up on social cues, so that's what's different, and we have to focus more on some of the social cues. So not only is it the same topics, but sometimes we have to add some other topics to it. So things like privacy, different types of relationships. How you teach the topic is going to be different. People with developmental disabilities often lack privacy to even explore their sexuality. And also many parents, like I said before, might address sexuality differently with a sibling, sometimes have let go of any dreams of relationships for their son or daughter. So it's hard for them to talk about it, or they're not expecting it, or they're not thinking about it. So those are the things that are different about human sexual development. And that was a brief overview of human sexual development. But my tips here are, you need to look at the biological age of the child, not the cognitive age. It's not what topics are taught, but how it's taught. Talking about sexuality does not give permission or make people go out and have sex. Studies have even shown that those who talk about sex or sexuality are more likely to wait to have sex and more likely to use protection if they've had these conversations. And when we don't teach about sexuality, our culture will. And do we want the media teaching sexuality to our children? I know I don't. So if we don't, that's who will step in, is the media, if there isn't any sexuality education in the schools. So I wanted to just touch base so far and see, before we get into more tools and tips around this, are there any questions about what's been covered so far, or should I just keep moving ahead? So just wanted to check in about that.
Catherine, we do have some questions that are coming in. The first question is,
okay.
Is there a curriculum that schools should be following to teach sex education?
Yeah, well, I do have the curriculum that I wrote, the one, Sexuality Education for Adults with Developmental Disabilities. I did revise it for schools, so there's another version of it. Very similar to the adult one. I changed some language and talked about how to work with parents. So that, I mean, I can offer that as a curriculum for schools. It's for sale on my website, and I will give you that information at the end. But that has 20 lessons and all the teaching tools and handouts that schools can use. I mean, I don't know what schools are using. I have sold it to different schools. But it's a great place for young people to get sexuality education, because you can do group activities rather than these one-on-one with a parent, or, you know, and you can hear what other people have to say, and it's a great learning environment.
Thanks so much, Catherine.
Another question?
Sure, we have a few more. I'm going to give you about 2 more if that's okay, and then we'll let you go on.
Yeah.
Perfect.
That sounds great.
So what if my nonverbal young adult never asks me questions about these issues and has for years resisted all my attempts to speak with him about them? If a situation or opportunity arises, I always respond by trying to speak about it, but I seem to get nowhere. Do you have any suggestions?
Great question. You know, I think there are times, this is true with any child, right? I mean, you're saying your child's nonverbal, but any child can say, oh, you know, don't talk to me about this. This happens all the time. I've been in the field for 20 years, and when I, you know, talked to my son about it and gave him a book on puberty, he threw it across the room. So, you know, it's not an easy topic for some. I'm not sure if your son or daughter is very private. Are they worried about what you want from them, or what sort of your agenda? But oftentimes when we talk about a scenario outside of ourselves, that's a really good way to do it. And to say, and maybe you've tried this, but, oh, I heard about this situation, or use a television show or something where there was abuse in the relationship. And you can use something outside of you and your son or daughter so that it's something you're talking about and it's not as personal. That usually helps quite a bit too. And I also have had parents just say to their children, you know, I need 1 minute and I'm just going to say this and you don't even have to look at me and I'm just going to get this out and I'm going to leave the room. And, you know, that's all you can do sometimes. But it also might be a time to involve the schools. You know, maybe it's just too much to talk to your own son, you know, the son or daughter just feels like, I don't want to talk to my parents. It's too private. It's, you know, no. So I would involve the school system or developmental disability agencies. Sometimes we'll have sex education series for youth. So, or a doctor. So reaching out and not feeling like you have to do all of it, but bring others in to help out.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the advice. I think that's going to help many families that are signed on. The next question is, my child uses an iPad as a communication device. Are there any apps that you know of to assist in teaching sexuality?
Oh, great question. I don't know. That is a great question. I know that there are some websites that might be useful, but nothing in particular around apps, but I could look into that for you.
And Catherine, I'm going to give you one more question before you move on, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you work with males and females together during your sessions?
Yeah. So what I have found is it's great to do that, have sessions with males and females, but it's also great to have time when it's just males and just females. I've seen the dynamic of the group change considerably when we get them apart. You know, it's time for girl talk, sort of a feeling, versus when there's boys in the room or men in the room. So I suggest both, but sometimes we can't do that, and that is fine. And I think it's great to have people together to talk about these conversations. So a mixture would be ideal.
So thanks so much.
Should I move on now, Melanie?
Yep, sure. If you want to move on, and then we'll hold as many questions as we can until the end. And the questions that we don't get to, we will forward for you to respond or to reply to us so we can respond, if that's okay.
Great, sure.
Perfect.
Sure.
Thanks so much.
So I'll move on for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll try to get the rest of the questions answered. So there are many tips and tools for discussing sexuality, and I'm going to go through some of those with you. So just in general, I've already said, give positive messages. You also don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know everything about sexuality. It's okay to say, you know, I don't know. Let me go check that out. Let me find out. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves to know everything about sexuality. You don't have to. It's okay to feel embarrassed. I also recommend that people say to their son or daughter or to someone that you're working with, you know, I'm sorry that I'm feeling a little embarrassed. It's only because no one ever really talked to me about this topic. It's a really good question, though. So you're sort of giving that positive message that it's okay to talk about this, even though I might feel a little embarrassed. It's okay to answer later, but really get back to the person. And I have 2 tips around values for parents. And I say, and I'll talk about this more when we talk about some of the questions. It's okay and important for parents to tell their values around sexuality. What is okay? What do you think is okay in a relationship? All of that. But staff, my recommendation for you is to give facts and a range of opinions, not your values, because who gets to decide what values you're going to give? There are some values that I'll show you later that are sort of common values that many people agree with, all people agree with, and so those are okay. But other ones that we would get different answers about, we can't share those values. Be concrete and graphic, as I'm sure you know from your own work with or having a child with a disability. The more concrete, the better, which makes it really difficult. It's a hard topic to talk about, and then we have to be so graphic. So it can be very challenging. Use repetition, and also use the media, like I mentioned earlier, using a television show, or some people even use soap operas and have a support group. at an agency where they would talk about the soap opera and say, what do you think about the way he's treating her? Or what do you think about what she just did? Or, just to use what they're familiar with and what they're watching as a tool for teaching about sexuality. So those are just some general tips. And then the other tip that I have is I break down questions into 3 types because they're very different in how you respond to each one. So a factual question is one that you give facts, right? Pretty straightforward. You just give information about. Then there's also values and opinions questions, which you're going to handle differently, and personal questions. So factual questions, you're going to use this, you can use this format, which is really helpful. So you reassure the person that it's a good question to ask. So you say, that's a really good question, and then find out what the person thinks or is really asking. And that comes from, you may have heard that joke about the young man who comes home and says, Mom, where did I come from? And the mother says, oh, the sperm and the egg, and does this whole thing on reproduction. And then little Johnny says, oh, that's funny because Sue's from Michigan. And so we really want to be sure we know what they're asking. So you can say, that's a really good question. What do you think? And see what they say. I think I'm from New Jersey. That's right, you are. And then you're done. So you decide, this is the part where you decide the message that you want to give. So what's the message? And I often will say that with my own children. What's the message I want to give right now about this topic or this situation? And then you answer the question simply using correct vocabulary. And encourage the person to give you feedback. So I'm going to also show you a little bit more about this number 4, answer the question simply using correct vocabulary. When we do work with, here's your question, ready? What is a boner? It's my favorite one to use. So what you're going to do is you're going to tell, this is called the Scarborough method, which was developed by Winifred Kempton, who is a sexuality educator for many years with people with disabilities. And she suggests that you, when working with someone with a disability, developmental disability, that you talk about the physical aspect of the question, the social aspect of the question, and possibly the emotional aspect of the question if needed. So with the question, what is a boner? You would say, well, a boner is a nickname for a penis, and it's when the penis gets hard. So that's what it is. Straightforward, factual, right? The social part has to do with privacy, responsibility, laws. So you might say something like, it's when the penis gets hard, which is also called an erection, and erections are something that need to be in private. You need to keep them covered when you're in a public place. So that might be the social aspect. Lots of times the social aspect has to do with privacy. And then emotional might be, some people feel embarrassed when it happens in a public place. And so emotional isn't always part of it, but you can think, are there any emotions that might be part of this? And you could give a range of emotions that might occur if somebody were to have this happen in public. So that's something to think about, just going back to this format when you answer the question using correct vocabulary, is to think about the physical, social, and emotional aspects of the question. All right. And then when we move on, we get to questions like, should I have sex with my boyfriend? Those are values, opinions questions. So it's going to be different depending on if you're a parent or a staff person. But in a lot of ways, it really is the question for the person asking it. But sometimes parents might say what they think, and that would be okay. I suggest you try to give it back to the person no matter what. But this piece about our values, this is your job to share your values. Our kids don't always adopt our values, but part of being someone's parent is sharing yours and explaining why you have those values. So you could either say, well, what do you think? When will you be ready? Or you can say, I don't think you should, and this is why. But as a staff person, it's not your job. So it's important to know your values and then learn to set them aside so you can help the person with the disability and figure out the question for themselves. It doesn't matter what you think. We want to teach people to think about their own values and what's important to them. And So you would give that question back to them. You'd say, what do you think? Do you think you're ready to have sex with your boyfriend? And try to get the conversation from them. They might keep saying, well, I don't know. Tell me what to do. And you say, that's not for me to decide. If I tell you yes or no, it doesn't really matter. This is your decision. I'm here to help you sort it out. So that's my suggestion around values questions. And this is the slide on the common values. So here are values that we can all agree with. I don't know anyone that would disagree with this. So it's important to respect others by treating them well and listening to them. It's important to get consent from a sweetheart for being sexual. Relationships should be equal and positive without violence or abuse. Sex should be safe and pleasurable for both. So these are values around respect, consent, equality. Those are things that many people agree with, and it's okay to share those. Those are considered common values. But whether you should have sex with your boyfriend or not is values that we don't want to share unless we're a parent. And then, you know, we start talking about this topic and people start asking us personal questions, which is a really good time to model that sex is private. It's an important message for young people to get, and it's perfectly okay to say, that's a personal question and I'm not going to answer that. Just as I'm not going to ask you personal questions about whether you had sex last night or not. That's a private question. And it's okay to set that boundary. And sometimes what will happen is you can say, you know, when people ask this question, they usually want to know, you know, how often do people have sex or something like that. You know, it's usually another kind of question underneath, so you can try to get at what that question might be as well. But you don't have to answer this, and you shouldn't as a staff person. And then I just want to tell you, just sort of thinking about your next steps, I provide workshops, and Melanie mentioned in my intro, but you can go to my website and you can see the different types of workshops that I offer. Here's my contact information as well, phone number and email, and my website and address if you need to reach me with any questions or anything, or you're interested in some training for a school district or a parent group or something. I am available to do that work for you. So I'd love to, and the timing is just right, see what last questions you have for the last 10 minutes.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And yes, timing was perfect. So we do have a few more questions that are coming in. In the beginning, you had mentioned the Green Mountain people. Can you talk a little bit about what this is about? Is this a group or an agency?
Yeah, so it's an agency called Green Mountain Self-Advocates, and they do a lot of work in the state of Vermont. And on my website, and they worked with me in developing the curriculum, and they're still active. Some of the self-advocates have led workshops on sexuality. Some of them use a curriculum in their agency with a staff person and team teach. And the curriculum that I wrote is designed for self-advocates to team teach with staff. So it's very well scripted. So it's getting people with disabilities more involved in sexuality education for others, too. So they're very active in that, and I've done a lot of work with them over the years.
Perfect.
Some of them, one of the self-advocates did some of the illustrations in the curriculum, and they designed the curriculum to be easily accessible for people with disabilities. They did a lot of graphics for the curriculum. And
wonderful. And Catherine, can I ask you, can you back up one slide with your contact information on it?
Sure, absolutely.
Perfect. If you want to leave it there, that way I'm sure that the attendees would love to take down your contact information for any follow-up interests that they may have. The next question is, can you talk a little bit about your peer sexuality educator program? And do the peers that they're training seem to receive this information better than they would from a parent?
Yeah, so the peer sexuality education program that I've done was with the Green Mountain Self-Advocates, and it was a 3-day workshop. Each session was a couple weeks apart, so we did one day, and then 2 weeks later another day, and then 2 weeks later another day. And it was basically going through the topics of the curriculum. but it was also talking about the difference between being a friend to somebody and a peer educator, and how that role is a little bit different. And really the design, breaking down the questions by types of questions was what I used with the peers, so they could get a sort of a distinction between when do they give information versus values. And then I thought, geez, everyone could probably use this, you know, sort of knowing the different types of questions. So that's the program, and then based on the person's interest, personality, they decide what they're going to do with this information. So they could talk to friends about the information, they could design a pamphlet, they could have a table at a self-advocate conference. Some of them have done national workshops, some of them team teach the curriculum. So it really depends on your interest and, you know, what you like to do. On my website, on the resource page, there is a pamphlet that the Green Mountain Self-Advocates developed on sexual self-advocacy and what that meant to them. So that's, some of the peer educators worked on that pamphlet. So it really kind of depends on what their interest is. I also do workshops where I train people to use the curriculum. So a staff person and a self-advocate, they come in teams to the training for 2 days, and I train them to work together to teach the curriculum as well. So that's another way that peer educators can, or self-advocates can be involved.
Okay, our next question is coming from a parent. It says, my son is 11 years old and has an autism diagnosis. He is high functioning. He may ask why people do certain actions, but when it's time to talk about it, he covers his ears. What can I do to get the message to sink in?
So he'll ask, it sounds like he asks questions, and then when you try to respond, he doesn't want to hear it. And, you know, he is 11, so, you know, my 14-year-old doesn't want to hear it still. So I think part of it is just, ew, gross, you know, don't talk about that. But I also think one thing you could do is find out why they're covering their ears, you know, sort of asking, can you tell me why you're doing that? To get sort of the meaning behind the behavior. And this is sort of another tip that I teach around the meaning behind behaviors and saying, well, can you tell me why you're doing that? So maybe it's just that awkward, you know, sometimes we think, oh, it's the disability, but maybe it's just because he's 11 and he's just uncomfortable with the topic. So it could be that. And then the other thing would be sort of things I've recommended before of having it be less personal.
Again, great suggestions.
Keep it away from him.
Perfect, thank you. Next question is, my son is 21. He is blind and has Asperger's. He shows no interest in relationships. Is this normal?
Yeah, you know, it's the one area where people say, you know, sometimes people with Asperger's or autism don't seem to have the desire or the hormonal something that makes them want to be sexual. So I have heard that some with people with autism. But also, you know, there's a new conversation happening now around just asexuality, that some people are not interested in being sexual. They don't have that sexual desire or drive. And maybe we're just seeing it more in that population because they're not hiding it as much as the general population. So we don't really talk about asexuality at all. But there are people who do not feel sort of that desire to be sexual. It also could be a piece of his disability. I don't know the details of it, but sometimes some of the, you know, sensations and being close to someone and touch can be a piece of that as well. So it's very kind of conflicts with their desire. So I have heard that as well, even for someone who's 21. Sometimes it develops later, but parents have also told me that it just has never really developed.
Catherine, can you recommend any videos for teens with developmental disabilities related to sexuality that would help create the conversation?
Help to sort of open the conversation up a little bit, right? Yeah, not really that I can think of as far as for people to use. There are some good resources around from James Stanfield Publishing Company. There's Circles, which is video, which is more about types of relationships. There's also something called Life Horizons, which are slides, which are all right. Yeah, so I think for you talking about younger kids, there are some videos that are regarded usually for older people around masturbation and using a condom that are recommended for people to watch on their own when they're a little bit older. So I think you're talking more about younger and trying to get a conversation going. But the ones that are for older people and are for them to watch alone are David Hingsberger. He was a sexuality educator from Canada and worked in the field of developmental disability, created some videos, and it's diverse city, so like Diverse City Press. And there's 3 videos, one on male masturbation, female masturbation, and putting on a condom.
Great. And Catherine, can you give any pointers on how do you keep or how to remind a teen about the private places?
Yeah, well, in the curriculum, what I have are some teaching tools where you have pictures of different places that you can show and talk about, whether it's private or public. I think also being really clear about the definition. So private is when you're alone with the door closed at home or in a bathroom at home. So being really clear about that and showing pictures and saying, is this public, is this private? I think that's the way to do it, to reinforce it. Sometimes even writing, in a school bathroom, that you write on the door, public bathroom, because sometimes people think, well, wait a sec, I'm in here by myself, but you have to be in the doors closed and people aren't coming in and out. So to really be clear about it. So you're home, alone, the door's closed, and people can't come in and out as being private. So a public bathroom is not private.
So Catherine, I know we have a lot more questions that are still coming in, so we're not going to get to all of them. So if we can connect after the session, that would be great. Okay. I do want to give you, if I can, 2 more questions, if I can keep you for a couple extra minutes.
Sure.
And also, can we request that you send the names of the videos that you had just mentioned so I can forward those with your PowerPoint if you're comfortable?
Sure.
Perfect.
Sure.
So the next question is, how do you decide what to talk about and when? I've talked to my 10-year-old about puberty, but not necessarily about intercourse.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, when kids are ready, they'll ask, right? So I think if they're 10, you can talk about puberty changes, but then they start to kind of wonder, like, well, wait a minute, so why, they want to go a little bit further. So I think really the advice is to answer the questions that are being asked, but also make sure they know before puberty what's going to happen so that they're not surprised or worried. And I think it's fine to talk about reproduction, too. I mean, I know, and I tell the story when my son was really little and asked, how did he get in there? I felt like his innocence was shattered by answering it, and I answered it, and he just skipped off and, went and played outside. So I think sometimes we get nervous that if we talk about things that it sort of brings them to some kind of different place where they're not innocent anymore, and we've shattered it, and they're totally fine with it. So it will not harm them to talk about reproduction, but you can certainly do it more gradually if you feel like they're not asking questions. I think it's just important for them to know what's going to happen during puberty, though, so that they're not scared or surprised.
Catherine, and the last question is, do you feel it's important for a male staff member to talk to the males and for a female staff member to talk to females?
Well, I think that, it's probably a bigger question. Like, I think it's great to have that. I think also for females to hear males talk about it in a respectful, healthy way is really good as well. You know, ideally, if you were teaching a class, you'd have both a male and a female there to show that to both, to everyone, but that's not always easy to do. But I do know that some male staff people feel, and female staff, feel more comfortable just talking to the person with the same gender as them, just because it just, you know, for males it feels scary, you know, they feel like they don't want to be accused of anything, and, you know, just feels a little more scary. Females feel like males might be trying to, you know, get in a relationship with them, so they, you know, so I think it really depends on the person and the situation, and ideally they would have both talking to them at different times so they could see that it's not just women that talk about this topic.
Perfect. Again, Catherine, thank you so much.
Is that all, Melanie?
Yeah, I think we're going to wind up emailing you the rest of the questions if you're comfortable with that, and getting some feedback from you.
That sounds good.
Perfect. And on behalf of the... Please go ahead.
I just wanted to say one last thing, just that, you know, to let people know that many people have learned how to address this topic, and that what they often say is once they start talking about it, it gets easier and easier, and that, you know, I'm just sort of giving you a little pep talk that you can do this as well, and I'm here for you as a resource if you need anything.
Oh, thank you so much. And on behalf of all the staff members at the Family Support Center of New Jersey and Transition Matters, and along with Catherine McLaughlin, we would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please feel free to explore future webinars at transitionmattersnj.org under the training section, or at the Family Support Center of New Jersey website, which is fscnj.org under resources. If you're interested in listening to this topic again, it should be posted within the upcoming week, or if you would like to listen to any of our archive webinars with topics such as transportation and travel training presented by Louis Hoffman and Cecilia Feely, community-based instruction and transition with Dr. Dan Baker, or the role of assistive technology in the transition years, which was presented by Advancing Opportunities in Disability Rights New Jersey. You can please just sign on to our website to access those sessions. And please explore our website for upcoming webinar sessions. On November 12th, we have an overview of mobile response services. November 19th, independent living skills, preparing young adults for life on their own. And December 11th, the impact of family dynamics on child behaviors. All those webinars are open for registration at this time. Again, we thank you for spending this time with us, and we look forward to providing resources and supports to you in the future. Catherine, thank you again.
Thank you.